I'm Matt Hankins. I'm an assistant professor at Arkansas Tech University, and today I'm going to be talking about the morphology of dust in the galactic center. I'm going to start off basically taking a little bit of a step back. And so when I heard that the sort of first forecast talk was canceled this morning, I decided to throw in a couple of slides at the beginning to basically talk a little bit more about sort of general forecast science and why you might be interested in using forecasts to study these types of environments. I'm starting off with this question: why study dust? And for probably most people on the line, this may be obvious, but for anyone who's maybe not that or hasn't really done so much of this before, that dust is just ubiquitous in all kinds of astrophysical environments. And so I'll talk quite a bit about star forming regions because that's what I really like to study. And so this is actually a dustin model for a nearby galaxy from a paper that I pulled, basically showing an infrared spectra. And so this galaxy is some sort of a star forming galaxy, I'm guessing, just basically. I mean, I don't actually study galaxies, so I'm just looking at this and seeing features that tell me there are lots of sort of star forming indicators going on. Essentially, if you pull up any sort of SED like this for a star forming region, you typically see these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, or some people may call them PAHs, from about 3 to 15 microns. They're sort of the spiky red features that you're seeing in that wavelength range. Then when you get to cooler dust at sort of the far infrared wavelengths, there's always some sort of a peak, that you're seeing in the far infrared. But what I'm going to be spending most of today talking about is sort of the warmer dust in the in-between region. And so you might notice that in between, about like 20 microns to about 50 microns, there's sort of this interesting transition that you're seeing in through there. And so uh, like Chick was mentioning in the last talk, that essentially there is, or that if you use forecast, it basically operates in this range from about 5 to 30 microns. And this is where we can basically probe this sort of a warm dust. Like I said, I'm just throwing in a couple slides to, do a little introduction to forecast. So I'm mainly going to be talking about forecast imaging observations, where Chip was talking about the spectroscopy that you can do with the grisms. But forecast is the faint object infrared telescope or the faint object infrared camera for the SOFIA telescope. It's a dual channel camera, and it has a short wavelength mode that operates from 5 to 25 microns and a long wavelength mode that goes from 25 to 37 approximately. And it does have a dichroic beam splitter. And so when you're doing imaging observations, you can actually use the short and long wavelength filters together, which is really useful. The camera has a field of view that's about 3.4 by 3.2 arc minutes, and the plate scale is just under an arc second for each dimension. And this is a photo of forecast on the plane. Forecast has done a lot of interesting science over the years, and so I'll talk mainly about star forming regions. So this is a sort of early science result from Forecast studying the W3A region, which is this prominent star forming region in our galaxy. But there have also been observations of like solar system objects and all kinds of other things. And so this is another sort of early science image that was done looking at Jupiter, where we're actually taking these different forecast imaging filters. And what you're seeing here is basically looking deeper into the planet. So, the warmer stuff that's showing up at 5 microns is the stuff that's more interior, and the cooler stuff that we're seeing, going out to 24 and 37 is stuff that's sort of the higher cloud layers. So kind of an interesting thing there. And then another science result that we had sort of early in the process was looking at this thing called the circumnuclear ring. So for those of you who might not be familiar, this is basically well, it's actually a disk, if you could expand it a little further out, but it's a disk of material that's orbiting around Sagittarius A star, the supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy. And I'm talking about a lot of these results, and I'll come back to the circumnuclear ring in just a little bit. But a lot of these are sort of near and dear to me because I was involved in quite a few of these observations way back when I was a grad student. I actually helped work on some of the delivery forecast to SOFIA, and so a lot of these are sort of fond memories for me. But that said, those are a lot of older results. There have been a lot of exciting new science that I'll talk about, and so I'll highlight a couple of programs from papers that have sort of been recently released. This is work that's led by Wang-Yi Lim and also Jim DeBiser, basically looking at these galactic star-forming regions. So on the left you have W51A, and on the right you see M17, and these are combinations of forecast data at 20 microns, 37 microns, and 70 microns. And so you can already sort of get this feel that when I'm talking about studying dust morphology, that when you're looking in the galactic or at objects in the galaxy, that SOFIA and forecast is able to pretty comfortably resolve a lot of the emission as it transitions between sort of the interior ionized gas to more the photodissociation regions and cooler dust.
I think we lost you, Matt. Hey, Matt, can you hear us?
I hope he can dial back in.
Uh, can you hear me? Am I back?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. I have connection issues sometimes, so I'll hop back on this. So apologies about that. If it happens again, I may have to call in and have somebody else share, which yeah, but we'll try to keep going. So essentially, what I was saying before it left off was that forecast you can already see from these images that essentially we're able to look at dust at these different ranges in these sorts of large star forming complexes. And so this is really going to be sort of the heart of what I talk about, the ability for us to probe the morphology of dust given the spatial resolution that we can achieve with SOFIA and forecast. And so all of that stuff that I was basically leading up to that is basically getting to the science I'm working on. So I said I liked studying star forming regions, but specifically what I spend a lot of my effort on is studying the galactic center. So this is the inner, it's about 200 parsecs of our galaxy that we're looking at here. And so this is a three-color map that's a combination of the SOFIA forecast 25 micron filter in blue, the 37 micron filter in green, and then Herschel 70 micron filter as the background. And this was one of the first SOFIA legacy programs that was carried out. And I think it was the first that was completed in terms of the observations back in cycle 7. And so you can basically see the outline of the survey that we did. So this isn't a complete survey of all of the region that's shown here. You can basically just see the outline, and I'll give the justification for why we chose to sort of dot these little places in the Herschel map. But we basically did this, and it was a big team of people that there's lots of collaborators out here to thank for basically getting this observed and worked out. But the reason why we wanted to study the Galactic Center, just to give some background for those who might not be familiar, it's actually a really, really special and interesting region. So when it comes to star formation, it's a really unique environment. If you look at this plot from Mills 2017, it basically gives this, or it's basically an overview paper that's looking at clouds that are part of the galactic disk. So that's sort of the Milky Way large scale data point you see here in blue versus the GC clouds. So this is basically looking at the gas density and the CO fractions that you get for galactic center clouds. that show that these are actually a lot more extreme. So they look things that are like, U-Lurgs and Lurgs and all these other sorts of galaxies that are really, really distant from us. But when we're talking about an environment that's in our own galaxy, we're able to really pick apart what's going on in the galactic center where we may not have the spatial resolution to do this in these, really distant extreme galaxies. But just to basically go down the bullet points, there's this really high gas density, like what's shown in the plot. There's a lot of turbulence. If you look at velocity plots of the galactic center, there's high gas and dust temperatures. There's strong and complicated magnetic fields, and then there's also a deep gravitational potential well. So the reason why we wanted to go about looking at this with forecast at 25 microns in particular is if you go and look at archival data of this region, you can go back to MSX, the mid-course space experiment, and basically look at a much lower resolution image at around 20 microns. And then you can go more recently to Spitzer MIPS at 24 microns. But you'll notice all of these red regions that are basically dotted throughout the region because it was really too luminous or too bright at 24 microns. And so there was a lot of saturation problems looking at the galactic center. So we really didn't have a very complete map of this very important region of the galaxy. And so, the reason why, or getting back to what I was talking about before, the reason why we chose to basically sort of limit ourselves to certain areas in this region was based off the 24 micron map from MIPS and also the MSX data. We basically made these, sorts of sensitivity calculations to, basically see what we would observe at our proposed survey depth. And so, it didn't necessarily make sense to go and look at some of these regions where we, didn't exactly expect to see sources. Okay, now that said, I'm going to basically do a zoom in of a bunch of different places in the data set to give you an idea of the kinds of things we see and to also give you an idea of some things you might look for in dust morphology. So I'm going to start by looking at this region that's highlighted in yellow right now, and this is Sagittarius A. And so looking at Sagittarius A, I've done this 3-color plot, and this is nothing too fancy. I basically just did the 3-color RGB from DS9, where I've opened up this archival Passion Alpha image from HST, and then the SOFIA forecast data at 25 and 37 microns in green and red. And so something I'll point out here, so this is the circumnuclear disk that I was alluding to earlier in the earlier science paper that was released from Forecast. And so we could basically do the little, side-by-side comparison. And the difference between this initial observation that was done with Forecast and what we did in the Galactic Center survey is we basically expanded the coverage all around the circumnuclear disk. That before, this was basically just a single pointing observation focused on the disk, where now we can see all kinds of structures extending out from the circumnuclear disk that we really didn't get in the observations before. And then I'll point out this star-forming complex just over to the right that hasn't really been studied a whole lot, but it actually has a lot of interesting things going on. And so this is one of those things, like I was mentioning before, really kind of considering the high-resolution nature of the SOFIA forecast data, that essentially the HST Passion Alpha map, this is a near-infrared observation. It's much higher spatial resolution than the SOFIA observations, but we actually see a really nice correspondence between what we see in the ionized gas and the emission that we're seeing at 25 and 37 micron, including some of these sort of interesting linear filaments that you see there. There's also the sort of bow shock source, the G359.858 plus 0.004. And then there are these sort of curious 25 micron blobs underneath that we still don't quite know what those are exactly. They don't seem to have a stellar source associated with them that we can easily identify. But again, kind of going back to what makes SOFIA so valuable is if you do a comparison of this region between MSX, Spitzer, and SOFIA going left to right, That essentially the MSX data is much lower resolution. So if you're comparing, the 22 to 25 microns from MSX to SOFIA, you're talking about a resolution that's factored like 4 to 5 times better. And this is also about the same difference in terms of Ys, in terms of your ability to spatially resolve things. And if you're talking about things at the galactic center in particular, the beam corresponds to a physical size of about 1/10 of a parsec. And so you really can dig down into, individual H2 regions, except for sort of the most ultra compact and compact H2 regions. Okay, so from here, I'm going to, move on to talking about the sickle region, which is highlighted in yellow right now, and then I'll show an image of what's known as the arches region because it has those sort of arch clouds. And so in the sickle, we can basically zoom in, and this is the same sort of 3-color combination that I was showing before, and there's all kinds of interesting structure that you can pick out almost immediately. So if we zoom in on this red region that I just highlighted, you can basically see that we have these like pillar-like structures that, almost make you think sort of like the pillars of creation, if you're, used to seeing that HST image. But at this sort of a distance, these are actually even larger structures than what that would be. But they seem to have these sorts of interesting, fingers poking out, and you can see that they nicely correspond with the ionized gas that you're seeing in Passion Alpha. You can also go to this yellow region that I've highlighted now, what's known as the ladder region. And again, you can see this really nice correspondence between what we're seeing in the dust emission and then also the sort of ionized edges that trace this region out. Now going to the arches. So this is the arches. Again, it's named for the sort of structures that you're seeing in the clouds that kind of appear very arched. And when people sort of first looked at this in really early, I guess, VLA images, they sort of look like these big blobby arches, but we see all kinds of definitions or definitive features inside of these filaments. And so, just zooming in on one of the really interesting regions, so there is the ionized gas, again, that you're seeing from the Hubble observations, but we have this really nice correspondence in the forecast data that you can basically see some of these almost perpendicular filaments sticking out that have 19 and 37 micron emission associated with them. And so this is really cool when you can really, look in depth at the comparison between the ionized gas and what you're seeing for the warm dust. Okay, and now for the last part that I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to evolve a little bit beyond talking about just dust morphology. So I'm going to talk about this region that's highlighted in the sort of pink here. And this is what's known as the H2 regions. So this is a set of H2 regions that were originally discovered in the radio. The fact that they're called the H2 regions is not special. It basically boils down to the fact when folks first discovered them, they went around the Sagittarius A region and named things A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And this happened to be the collection of sources they called H. But looking at these objects, I'm going to talk in particular about these sources, H1, H2, and H5, and these are H2 regions, which are thought to be basically powered by individual massive stars, or at least that's the sort of understanding of them from the literature before the work we did. And so I'm going to first show a couple of these sources, one known as H1 and H2 on the left and right. And this is just a combination of some near-infrared data from Hubble, again, the Passion Alpha in blue, but this time I'm showing a continuum filter to show stars in green, and then the SOFIA observations at around 20 microns in red. And we'll also point out that the ionizing sources for these H2 regions are known. They're actually indicated by the crosshairs here. And in the case of H2, we actually have found sort of two interesting mid-infrared sources, where before this region is sort of traditionally thought of as just one source, but we found a sort of neighbor to it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide. So, like I said, I promised to get beyond just talking about, morphology. So let's actually talk about how you can use forecast data to do a more detailed study looking at dust temperatures. And so frequently, one of the analysis tools that we use with forecast data is creating a dust temperature model, or I often call them like a temperature map, essentially. And what you would do to create something like this is essentially assume that the dust emission is some sort of a gray body, that essentially it's a black body times some sort of a frequency dependent beta or some sort of a power law dependence. And so if you have that, you can take a ratio of the two filters or the two emission filters that you have, and it's basically given by this lower equation that the ratio of the emission of the two filters is going to be equal to the difference of the division of the wavelengths to whatever power law you're assuming for the emissivity of the dust times the ratio of the black body functions. And the key here is that the dust temperatures in both of those black body functions is the same. And so this is something you can't solve, pencil and paper, but you can go and solve this numerically using a root finding algorithm. So, if there are any, Python users on the line, typically I do this with fsolve from SciPy. But to give you an idea of, sort of qualitatively what this is doing, I have this plot on the right that's basically showing these different black body curves going through. And I've highlighted these yellow regions, which basically show the around 20 microns and around close to 40 microns, because frequently we use the 37 micron filter to do this. And essentially what we're able to constrain in terms of dust temperature, it's really like looking at the slope of the 2 points in through there. And so you get this idea that for dust temperatures that are way hotter than what we can get, or basically things that are in the Rayleigh Jean's tail rather than near the peak region, we don't really constrain very well. But when you start talking about dust that is peaking, around this, you can see noticeable differences between the emission that you see around 20 microns and around 40 microns. And so qualitatively, that's what we're doing. But again, we're doing it, more precisely with math. So in order to make temperature maps, some advice that I have, so whenever you're doing this, you're going to be solving the dust temperature pixel by pixel throughout an image. And so the important things are that the images have to be aligned and on a common pixel grid in order to do this. And for those of you who are Python users, I recommend using the reproject package to accomplish this. And I can include this link as part of the chat on Slack afterwards since it's here. The other thing is that images have to be a common spatial resolution. And so to do this, I recommend using the convolution function from AstroPy. It does a really good job with being able to convolve data. And just noting that if you don't correct for this beam size difference, even the slight difference between like the 19 and 37 micron filters in SOFIA can lead to some weird edge artifacts if you don't correct for this. Okay, now that said, if we go back to looking at our source H1, the color map that you're seeing on the left, or the right, is actually the dust temperatures that we have predicted using this method of constructing a temperature map. And so you see here that we basically have the star indicated by this little yellow star, and the hottest dust is sort of close to the star, kind of making an arc shape. So we actually know this source is some sort of a bow shock. And so you can see that we pick out temperature as being warmest there because that's probably physically closest to the star. Something else you'll notice as part of this is that I've listed a series of contours going out from the central star that are shown as these gray dashes. And so it's possible for us to actually predict how warm we think dust should be at certain radii from the star. And this is something that we can calculate exactly. And so I know I'm going to run a little short on time, so I might go through this a little quickly, but I can, send this slide or two to folks who might be interested afterwards. But essentially, the qualitative picture is that you have a star, it's giving off photons, and this is a hot star, so probably in the UV. It hits a dust grain. The dust grain absorbs that radiation, and that causes the dust grain to heat up. And then it's going to emit in the infrared corresponding to the temperature of the dust grain. And so, talking about the math behind this, it's basically energy conservation, that, the power absorbed has to be the power emitted. And so there are expressions for what the absorbed power and what the emitted power for the dust grain should look like. And this comes from Bruce Strain's book, The Physics of the Interstellar and Intergalactic Medium. And typically when you do something like this, you'll assume that these sort of Q factors, these are dependent on the exact nature of the dust grains that you have, that they have some sort of a temperature dependence. And so if you do this and plug these things back into the power equation up top, you can basically solve for the dust temperature in a form like this. And to give you a rough idea of, what this looks like, if you assume a certain luminosity of the star, a distance of 0.1 parsecs, and a dust grain size of 0.1 microns, you get that the dust temperature is about 100 K, just to give you an example calculation for common astronomical silicate dust. Okay, so that's how the contours were made in H1. Now let's move on, look at H2. So H2, you see the dust contour, or basically the dust map and the contours that we have here. And we basically see that the second source that I noted before, this H2 Southwest, it actually looks too hot to be heated by the star that we know to be powering the other region. And so this is a really interesting thing because we've actually found that this has to be some sort of distinctive, locally heated object. Another example of this is in this source H5 that I pointed out at the beginning. And this is actually the most curious object of the lot because it has a star that's known to be the ionization source, which is pointed out by the crosshairs and also the star on the color temperature map. And so if we do the same sort of analysis for this, we actually see that the two infrared peaks that show up in the SOFIA forecast data for the temperature maps, that these are actually too warm to be responsible or to have been heated by the star that we know as the ionization source. And so this is a really weird thing when you think about it, something that appears to be externally ionized but internally heated, but this caused us to look closer. And so if you actually go to some of the near-infrared Hubble data, we actually went and investigated, what's in the core of these sources, and we actually found two bow shocks. And so these are near-infrared continuum filters, so very, very hot dust with some sort of a source that appears to be forming a bow shock in them. And so, yeah, this technique is really, really interesting and useful for being able to pick apart complicated H2 regions. And so with that, I know I'm basically out of time, but I was just going to mention that the SOFIA Cycle 7 program that we have, we're actually continuing some observations in the Galactic Center in Cycle 9. Presently, we've observed all of the things that you see in yellow right now, and the blue are things that we hope to observe in the remainder of Cycle 9 this summer. And so with that, I'll say thanks everyone for listening, and if there are any questions, and special thanks to the SOFIA Science Mission Operations and everyone for making these programs possible, and also my collaborators listed here.